The University of Mississippi had 139 students. Of these, 135 enlisted to serve in the Confederate Army. The school building was used as a war hospital, and all but 4 members of its student body gathered together at casualty rate, with every man either returning injured or not at all. The Colonel Moore became one of the company's first casualties by accidentally blasting his own foot. The remaining group continued to fight and almost made it to the end. It was the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg when the Greys merged with a reckless charge against the Union soldiers. Of the Confederate men involved, half perished, and not a single student from the University of Mississippi survived the clash.
The University Greys, or Company A of the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment, was nearly entirely comprised of students and faculty from the University of Mississippi. So many had in fact enlisted that the school was unable to open its doors in 1861, with only 5 students enrolling. These young men fought gallantly throughout the war, and their losses were many, but none are remembered more vividly in my recollections than that of their efforts at Gettysburg. During Pickett's charge up Cemetery Ridge, they pushed farther into enemy lines than any other company and were rewarded for their efforts with 100% casualty rate, with every man of the company being killed or wounded. As the battle there progressed, I went up to my little first aid hospital behind the Barn Road embankment, and under its cover I seated myself for business. Presently the wounded began to come in crouchingly, for many were killed and wounded before the charge began. The first to arrive, borne on a litter, was a princely fellow and favored son of the 11th Mississippi. I saw in an instant a condition of terrible shock. Keeping everybody close to the ground, I turned him and he pointed to his left arm. I quickly exposed it and found that a cannonball had nearly torn it away between the elbow and the shoulder. I made some encouraging remark when he smiled and said, "Why, doctor, that is nothing. Here is where I am really hurt." And he laid back the blanket and exposed the lower abdomen, torn from left to right by a cannon shot, largely carrying away the bladder, much intestine, and a third of the right half of the pelvis, but in both wounds so grinding and twisting the tissues that there was no hemorrhage. I then surveyed his personality, observing the tender devotion on the part of his litter bearers, and I saw a singularly attractive creature. Through his deathly pallor, I could detect a sunburned blonde who in health would show a strong and ruddy countenance. A large head with a tousled shock of reddish golden locks like a mane, with the musculature and form of an athlete. Deferentially polite, there was something singularly self-confident and manly about him. Without the slightest change of voice, he asked, "Doctor, how long have I to live?" "A very few hours," I replied. "Doctor, I am in great agony. Let me die easy, dear doctor. I would do the same for you." His soul peered from the depths of his blue eyes in an appeal of anguish that cut me to the heart, and I replied, "You, dear noble fellow, I will see to it that you shall die easy." No word or detail of this scene has faded from my memory. There was no thought of the dramatic. It was dreadfully genuine and naturally spontaneous in the unconscious creating and acting of a grander tragedy than we might ever hope to play. I called for, and my hospital knapsack bearer, Jim Rao, quickly handed me a 2-ounce bottle of black drop, a concentrated solution of opium much stronger than laudanum. I poured a tablespoon of it into a tin cup with a little water and offered it, but before his hand could reach it, a thought flashed into my mind, and withdrawing the cup, I asked, "Have you no message to leave?" It startled him, and in a low moaning wail he cried, "My mother, oh my darling mother, how could I have forgotten you? Quick, I want to write." By that time, all who were crouching under the low shelter were crowded around, oblivious of their own injuries and weeping silently. I took my seat on the ground close beside him and lifted him over, reclining on my chest, his face close to mine to steady his head, his right elbow in the hollow of my right hand to support and steady his arm, and a pencil slipped into his hand. Jim Rowell had provided the sheet of paper held on the smooth lid of the hospital knapsack improvised as a desk. He wrote rapidly. All of this transpired in haste, murmuring to himself the words audible to me, for I looked the other way. He began with the place and the date. On the battlefield, July 3rd, 1863.
My dear mother, this is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you that I have died like a man. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret at dying is that she is not free, and that you and my sisters are robbed of my worth, whatever that may be. I hope this will reach you, and you must not regret that my body cannot be obtained. It is a mere matter of form anyhow. This is for my sisters too, as I cannot write more. Send my dying release to Miss Mary. J.S. Gage, Company A, 11th Mississippi. This letter is stained with my blood.
He wrote little more than half a page, into which he poured with vehemence his whole soul of tenderest love, never faltering for a word, and a message towards the last, with a name that he wrote silently, conscious of the presence of strangers. But the message was too personal and sacred to him for me to trespass, for it was holy ground. The last line he softly repeated aloud. I dipped this letter in my dying blood. With that he turned down the blanket and, seizing the letter, pressed the back of it into his oozing bloody wound and handed it to me, giving his mother's address and begging to be sure she got that letter. I rose from the ground and had him supported when he turned to me with a reminder of my promise and of his hopeless pain. I handed him the cup, and he feebly waved it, saying, "Come around, boys, and let us have a toast. I do not invite you to drink with me, but I drink the toast to you and to the Southern Confederacy." We laid him back on some improvised soft headrest, and I rushed off to work amongst the wounded. But from Virginia I saw that his mother got the letter, its content unrevealed except to herself.
A Confederate soldier came back in 1888 for the reunion the next year, and of course this was fresh in everyone's mind. And he had claimed to have buried his brother on the fields of Pickett's Charge, and he was looking for the remains. And one of the skeletons had a cracked hip bone. A bullet had gone through the hip bone. So he was satisfied that that was the correct remains of his brother.
I had listened to the article, or to the video, of them talking about Frederick Pfeiffer finding these skeletons in his field in Gettysburg in 1887, 22 years after the war, or 24 years after the war. Weeks later I came across, or days later, I came across a story of Jerimiah Gage from the 11th Mississippi being killed there just before Pickett's Charge. And it seems to me like the stories almost have to be connected. Jerimiah Gage was hit in the lower abdomen. It said the cannonball took off a third of his pelvic bone. Yet the other story said his brother was shot in the hip. Very similar locations, could vary. Both 11th Mississippi, almost have to be the same person. Anyway, I thought it was interesting.
In 1887, Fred Peffer accidentally plowed up a burial trench that was undiscovered. I'm going to show you where that was.
All right, well, here is the monument to the 11th Mississippi that shows the furthest point of advance on July 3rd of 1863. And as you can see here, shows 393 combatants, killed in action or died of wounds, 110. And then wounded and captured, 193. I mean, so, and it says non-casualty, 53. So out of 393 combatants, 53 were non-casualty.
So during Pickett's charge, the Confederates attacked across the Emmitsburg Road here, and the 11th Mississippi landed about here, and they got to the wall. Their colors were captured. A bunch of them were killed and wounded and captured right around here. So in 1887, when Fred Peffer was plowing, he accidentally hit a burial trench, and he dug up, accidentally, 7 Mississippi soldiers. And we know that, and this happened in 1887, and it happened right around here, near the 12th New Jersey Monument, which is up there, the Buck and Ball Regiment. And we know they were Mississippi soldiers because after he tried to identify the bodies and failed to do so, one of the methods he used, they had no identification discs or anything like that on them, but they did have Mississippi buttons on them. And he reinterred the bodies behind the barn, and I'll show you where that is. But I'm going to show you, I brought this out. We have some of the items that had fallen off when they reinterred the bodies. And he kept some of the buttons and a few other items. And it was not grave robbing. He didn't do it for monetary value or anything, but it was in case at some point they could possibly make an identification of those remains. And so what you see here, and I put the one button in backwards so you can kind of see it. There's a star there and it says Mississippi, and there is an I for infantry. And the buttons also had chunks of the uniform still on, because, you know, this was in 1887, so it's not that long after the battle, and so there was still some of the cloth attached, and there was some of the leather goods. So the Peffer family kept these items, and hoping that maybe at some point they could identify the remains. They made an attempt to have the remains moved to the Confederate cemetery at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and nobody wanted to pay for it. There was no one you could go to try to have that happen. And the Peffers were farmers; they didn't have the money to do that. And so what he did was he reburied the remains. And when I was a kid, I grew up with this story, and my grandfather always told me it was behind the barn, meaning the Bryant Farm barn, which you see right here. 1888, a Confederate soldier came back, and this story made it into the newspapers, and both of Gettysburg's newspapers, and we have copies of those. And a Confederate soldier came back in 1888 for the reunion the next year, and of course this was fresh in everyone's mind. And he had claimed to have buried his brother on the fields of Pickett's charge, and he was looking for the remains because his brother never came home and the bodies were never exhumed. And so he found my grandfather through talking to people in the town, and apparently his story was, or the story passed down to me was, he was captured at the wall. His brother was killed, and he asked permission as a POW to bury his brother because I guess he could see him laying out there. And he knew that because he buried the body that his brother was shot through the hip. And he found my great-great-grandfather, Fred Peffer, and came out there, and he asked if he could view the remains. So he and my great-great-grandfather dug them up, and one of the skeletons had a cracked hip bone. A bullet had gone through the hip bone. So he was satisfied that that was the correct remains of his brother, and he took him home to Mississippi. Now there's no record of this. This is just family lore, but it was passed down directly from my grandfather, who got it from his grandfather. So it's a pretty solid story. We do have the tangible artifacts from the graves. A few years ago, I was doing a training exercise with cadaver dogs. Now at the Gettysburg Museum of History, we have a lot of blood relics and things like that. You know, we have Lincoln's blood, we have Kennedy's blood, and they were testing some cadaver dogs on old blood, and they set up an experiment with some, and these dogs had worked on some of the big cases like the 9/11 stuff. They were looking for remains. So they asked if they could come out and look for the graves, and I asked one of my park ranger friends if we could do it, and he said, just don't make a mess, you're not going to dig them up or anything. I said, no, nothing like that, but I just want to try to confirm the story. So they had 3 dogs, I think it was, and this is about 10 years ago, and each one went out, and they went around this whole area, and I told them behind the barn, so they went all over, and all 3 of them hit on a spot out there.